Jane had just started preparing breakfast when Leanne and Charlie arrived. Giving Leanne and Charlie a hug each, she went to have a shower and get dressed, leaving her mother to care for the guests for a while. Stepping into the shower and turning on the spray, she stared down at the now faded scar on her chest, and her mind wandered back to a difficult childhood. She had only just begun to appreciate why her family had handled her like she was a china doll, and thinking back now, she could hardly blame them. "Mom, I don't want to go to hospital. It's scary and horrible, and besides, it's Christmas. They can't be doing operations now." Sylvia Albright lifted her 8-year-old daughter onto her lap and tried to soothe her. "Listen, sweetheart, people still get sick at Christmas. All that will happen is you'll go to sleep, and when you wake up it will all be over, and those awful pains you've been getting will be gone." The little girl looked at her mother with large blue eyes. "You promise, Mummy?" After a gentle kiss dropped on her daughter's forehead, her mother replied, "I promise." Turning off the spray, she stepped out and dried herself off, smiling as she heard a familiar male voice in the living room. She would have to talk to him properly about it soon. Today was not the right day for it, but the subject would have to be broached. She could hear her mother's voice in the kitchen as she finished preparing breakfast for her. The whole thing had been a strain on her parents, she thought back sadly. Her mother called her loudly from the living room. "Jane, your dad's on the phone." Forcing herself out of her thoughts, she went to wish her father a happy Christmas. The dinner was all eaten. The pile of presents was still beneath the tree, awaiting the big opening. Jane began to clear the dishes. Her mother and Mitch offered to help. "Oh, come on, there must be something I can do to help," said Leanne sullenly. Jane smiled and put a hand on her shoulder. "There is. You can go in the living room, put your feet up and relax." Leanne gave a sulky look, but did as she was told. Charlie was a month off one and was just beginning to walk by pulling himself up on the furniture and easing himself around a room that way. Gurgled happily. An hour later, with everyone seated in the living room, glass of wine in hand, except for Charlie, who was happily drinking milk from his bottle, everyone opened their presents. There were gasps of appreciation as each present was opened in turn. Mrs. Albright had even got a present for Leanne and Charlie. At last, when everything had been opened and the paper cleared away, Leanne suggested a walk. Mrs. Albright readily agreed. Jane, however, excused herself, saying she was tired and that she would have a hot chocolate ready for each of them when they returned. Mitch insisted he would stay behind too, leaving Tony, Mrs. Albright, Leanne and Charlie to go out in the grey afternoon for their walk. Mitch sat down in a chair and sighed. "Well, it's been a good day. You know, I do believe your mother isn't quite so bad. I quite like her." Jane nodded. "She's not. The other night, after you left, we had a blazing row. We both said some pretty awful things, but it's sorted out now. She doesn't mean to do it. It's taken me all this time to figure out why they treated me like they have. Speaking of which, there's something I have to talk to you about when we've got more." She was stopped suddenly as Mitch pulled her onto his lap. "Hey you," she scolded. "Let me go. I'm trying to be serious." She tried to keep a straight face, but it was impossible. Putting her head on his shoulder, she sighed contentedly. "Yeah, well, there's something I've got to talk to you about and all," said Mitch, a touch of worry creeping in his voice. Jane lifted her head from his shoulder, balking at the words she was sure he was going to utter next. "What is it? Dumping me for a newer model, are you?" she answered, only half joking. "Don't be soft. I wouldn't do that. It's just you still have a present here you haven't opened." Tilting her head questioningly as he produced a small parcel from his shirt pocket, neatly wrapped in Christmas paper, she took it off him uncertainly. "What is this? Some kind of trick?" she asked as she began to unwrap it. "It is not, and be careful with it once you've opened it." Tearing the paper, she opened the small box inside, giving a small gasp at what was in it. "What's this then?" said Jane, kicking herself mentally for asking such a question. "What kind of question is that? I think you know what it is. So, will you marry me then?" Jane's eyes filled with tears. Mitch's eyes were full of softness, love and admiration. She was sure she would wake up in a minute to find it was all a dream. She nodded her head slowly. "Yes, of course I will," she said, leaning over to kiss him.